This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin, Trump, and the end of the US dollar. We're also going to be talking about the US Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, which many of you have asked about. Now, as anyone who has ever taken a US civics class knows, the US federal government can be understood as consisting of four main branches. You have big food, big pharma, big banking, and big war. And these four branches often work together. For example, big food makes sure that from childhood onward, you're on the fast track to diabetes and obesity. And then big pharma puts you on a permanent monthly prescription plan that will not make you better, but that will keep you alive long enough to make a significant contribution to their bottom line while you continue to consume big foods products. Likewise, big banking works hard to help fund big war. And all these branches work together. It's a beautiful thing. All four branches of the U.S. federal government are ultimately funded by the U.S. dollar, which runs on a consensus mechanism that's neither proof of work nor proof of stake, but rather what's called proof of war. And what this means is if you try to use a different currency than the U.S. dollar for international commodity trade, then the U.S. bombs you back into the Stone Age if you're Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, or someone like this. So that's the U.S. federal government, short civics lesson. Next, we have Bitcoin and its long-held mission of separating money from state. That analogy is, of course, taken from the separation of church and state. Here we're separating money from state, or at least trying to. The cypherpunk dream has been to have a new form of money that's not controlled by governments or central bankers. Today we have a president-elect who wants the U.S. federal government to set up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So the big question here, if your goal is to separate money and state, how do you feel about the state accumulating lots of the best money on earth, which is, of course, Bitcoin? Now, if the state, if the federal government weren't comprised of big food, pharma, war, banking, plus the intel agencies, I might be a little less loath to think of new ways to give the U.S. government another 100 years of funding that it can use to continue to destroy the world. Though, as we're going to see in a minute, setting up a strategic Bitcoin reserve might instead actually blow up the U.S. federal government's main funding source. Back to that in a moment. But here today, if Trump, beginning January 2025, if Trump and Vance, with the help of Elon, Tulsi, RFK Jr., etc., can rein in the security state, can rein in the blob with all of its tentacles, then building a strategic Bitcoin reserve that can be used by the U.S. federal government to pay down its enormous debt makes a lot more sense to me. But you almost have to have this reformation before you should put in place permanent Bitcoin funding. What I would really hate to see is another 80 years of rule by intel agencies that's now being funded by Bitcoin and a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Another wrinkle here is the ongoing great power competition. So even if I don't necessarily want the US government to have Bitcoin, I don't want to live in a world where China and Russia, both of which have political systems that I have zero desire to live under, a world where China and Russia own a lot of Bitcoin and the U.S. federal government owns little or none. So we have to take the geopolitical angle as well. An alternate version of the U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve that really hasn't been discussed, but that I would prefer to get behind, would be a reserve that's held personally by U.S. citizens like you and me. Instead of the federal government buying Bitcoin, why not just send me a little fiat? I'll buy Bitcoin and I'll hodl it for the next 10 generations of my U.S. descendants. This could be a much better idea than creating another large, centralized honeypot of Bitcoin, and much more congruent with the traditional ethos of decentralization that Bitcoiners preach. Unfortunately, this version of the strategic Bitcoin reserve is not going to happen either. But before we discuss what I think is actually going to happen, I just ask you, if you're finding this video helpful so far, then please help to support this channel's educational mission. Hit the subscribe button, that really does help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. So how would you even set up a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve in the first place? Let's begin with the Bitcoin that the U.S. government already holds. The U.S. government holds approximately 198,000 Bitcoin. Nietzsche's quite famous for saying that everything the state says is a lie, and everything it has stolen. This is certainly true when it comes to U.S. government holdings of Bitcoin. They were able to steal approximately 94,000 Bitcoin were seized by the DOJ from the Bitfinex hack, and then we have the Bitcoin that was seized from Silk Road. That's approximately another 69,000, and then there's another piece from the Silk Road confiscation, another approximately 50,676. Bitcoin. So that roughly gets you to this level of 198,000. There's been some rumblings that they're currently trying to sell some of it, but whatever it is, all the Bitcoin that the US currently has, it did not mine, but it actually stole from other people, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear. And I personally think it's unethical, perhaps even what you might call bad karma, to use the stolen Bitcoin as the foundation of a US strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think the stolen Bitcoin should be returned to Ross Ulbricht when he's released from jail soon, and also to the customers of Silk Road and the victims of the Bitfinex hack. This is also something that will unfortunately never happen, but it is important to remember and to remind people that this is all stolen Bitcoin. At minimum, what do I expect to happen? At minimum, I'm expecting an executive order from Trump really early on that makes the stolen Bitcoin the kernel of the new U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve. So then what's next? The next step is to decide how to fund the purchase of more Bitcoin. The Lummis bill suggests dumping U.S. gold holdings and using the proceeds plus some extra funding to buy 200,000 Bitcoin per year, every year for 5 years, so a total of 1 million Bitcoin. Now, this is cool on many levels. Most importantly, it really triggers the shiny yellow rocks lobby. They're not too happy to hear that this might be the plan. Second, that kind of signal plus actual buying would easily send Bitcoin above, I would say above $5 million per coin over the next 5 years. This is a tremendous amount of buying that itself will drive the price higher and higher as it happens. I think this plan is especially clever as well because it would instantly hurt the BRICS countries who are trying to build their economies on gold and their trade on gold, especially hurt our rivals Russia and China, which hold a lot of physical gold. Because by doing this, you'd be basically monetizing Bitcoin at a nation state level while demonetizing gold at a nation state or global level, because you're dumping gold to buy Bitcoin. This would be the signal, and these would be the actual financial flows as well. Saylor has pointed this out in recent interviews. This one, Michael Saylor saying, dump your gold, sell all the US gold and buy Bitcoin, then the trade is free. In other words, to accumulate the strategic Bitcoin reserve, you will demonetize the entire gold asset class, and our enemies hold gold in their banks, so their assets would go to zero. So this is also a form of geopolitical attack. It's pretty clever. What do I think would be Russia or China's response to an action like this? It's impossible to know for sure, of course, but if I were Xi, I would say, okay, that's wonderful, President Trump. Now, in response, what China's going to do is we're going to stop recycling our US dollar trade surpluses into US treasuries, into US stocks, into US real estate. We're going to use those trade surpluses that we have with the US instead to just buy Bitcoin. And then other countries with trade surpluses with the US could do the same thing. In that case, what are you going to see? You're going to see US stocks and real estate crash quite quickly relative to Bitcoin. One Bitcoin, in other words, will buy you a lot more house after that than before it did. You'll also see a massive interest rate spike. Bond prices down on less foreign buying, yields up. These always move inversely. You see this massive interest rate spike on U.S. government debt that would need to be neutered by Fed money printing and buying treasuries. More Fed money printing like this would accelerate Bitcoin's appreciation relative to the US dollar even more quickly. And while that's great for Bitcoin and Bitcoiners, I think it's quite problematic for our fiat masters if the US government still requires that exorbitant privilege, as de Gaulle called it, that exorbitant privilege of money printing to keep its doors open. Now, if the Fed also gets in the game, the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central bank, if the Fed gets in the game and starts to print money to buy Bitcoin, rather than just using the proceeds from selling gold that the Fed supposedly holds, that's also an instant death knell for the U.S. dollar, which everyone knows is nothing more. The U.S. dollar is nothing more than a liability of the Federal Reserve. It's easy to forget this, but you can just take a look at any $1 bill in your wallet, and you'll see on it says Federal Reserve Note, which is kind of creepy when you think about it. The Fed did not exist when this country was founded. It was never meant to exist. Now, what happens instead if, instead of selling the gold or raising taxes or having the Fed immediately print new money, what if we just have the U.S. Treasury issue new debt, add a little bit of debt on top of the existing $35 trillion in debt to buy Bitcoin? The problem with this is just more debt that needs to be immediately sterilized by the Fed, who is still really the marginal buyer of last resort for U.S. Treasury debt. So this would result in money printing as well. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is if a strategic Bitcoin reserve is pursued aggressively in the U.S. next year, I think what you're looking at is not just a new and unusual national policy decision, but rather the beginning of a full global monetary reset. Because we're not talking about Bhutan or El Salvador buying Bitcoin here. We're talking about the current issuer of the global reserve currency, the U.S., telling everyone that they're willing to devalue the U.S. dollar in order to buy Bitcoin. U.S. is a completely different category of buyer when it comes to Bitcoin. Just imagine, for example, if the world's previous global reserve currency, the British pound, let's imagine it had been fiat rather than much more gold-based back in 1918 or 1945. And then let's imagine that the Bank of England, the central bank for the UK, itself began to print British pounds to buy US dollars. What do you think would happen if news of this had gotten out? It would have the instant result of ending the British pound as global reserve currency and enshrining the US dollar. This is sort of what happened anyway after Bretton Woods. It didn't happen because the UK was printing pounds. But basically, this is what we're talking about here, something like this, a full global monetary reset or transition. Now, while there are many unknowns here, if this happens, it's going to be, I believe, unbelievably chaotic and really contrary to the incentives of the powers who have been running the U.S. federal government and the intel agencies for the past 50 years. So to summarize, I don't see any version of reality where an aggressive U.S. Bitcoin strategy empowers, strengthens the U.S. dollar rather than massively weakening it. So either Trump doesn't understand this when he says that buying Bitcoin is going to strengthen the U.S. dollar, or maybe he does understand it and he's playing some 4D or 5D chess. This is the other possibility. As someone who loves Bitcoin and hates the U.S. dollar, I'm completely fine with that. I'm also fine if it ends up blowing up the four branches of the current federal government in the process, big pharma, food, banking, and war. That might actually be faster than trying to reform them. I just don't think it's going to happen, though. I don't think we're going to get an aggressive strategic Bitcoin reserve. You can call me old and jaded. What I expect instead, though, Trump to announce very early on a strategic Bitcoin reserve that will simply hodl the U.S.'s existing holdings of stolen Bitcoin. Probably not much more than that, though. Disclaimer here, very important. This is a very complicated puzzle, lots of moving parts, so expect my take on this to evolve over time. I think it's important not to be too rigid in one's thinking when it comes to new paradigms like this unfolding. And we're living in a very fast-moving and transitional time. And as we've seen in 2024, some really weird things can happen. So what do you think about this take on the strategic Bitcoin reserve? Do you think I'm missing something? If so, let me know in the comments below. While you're there, also hit the subscribe button. That really helps the channel. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.